Hello everyone, my name is Brooklyn Myers and I am an Elixir newbie. My goal is to help people adopt Elixir and grow as developers while doing the same myself. I do that by documenting and sharing my own experience in the Elixir industry. It's been an incredible journey so far and I look forward to taking the next step with you. So let's jump in to the Elixir Newbie Podcast. Elixir enables fast onboarding. It has a gentle learning curve, a high developer quality life, and it's known for its productivity. And that's why when I received an offer to interview for an Elixir position, I accepted, betting that I could learn enough in time. And I had no previous Elixir experience. I had no Elixir projects that were resume quality. I had dabbled with Elixir about a year prior, but I really had no reason to call myself an Elixir developer. And now the first interview was in 7 days. And if I passed that, the next technical interview would be in another 7 days. So I had about 14 days to prepare and learn enough to ramp into Elixir. And by sharing this story, I hope that I can take the lessons that I learned during that period and give them to you so that you can apply them and onboard yourself or even other developers into Elixir faster so that we can have more Elixir developers. And the point of the story is not to tell you how great of a learner I am. I'm really nothing special. The point is to be able to show that anyone can do this and to show the benefits that Elixir and the Elixir community provide that make it easier to transition into the industry and to learn the language effectively. I'm also going to share some strategies that you can employ that will allow you to learn more effectively. So there are some ways of learning that are more effective than others and can allow you to pick up new concepts in a faster period of time. So if your goal is to learn Elixir quickly, then there are going to be some lessons in this story that you can take away and then apply to your own progress, your own learning path, so that you can learn faster. Beyond learning, I'm also going to talk about how to build up a resume quickly, because in this case, I needed to build up enough Elixir experience in the first 7 days to at least have some Elixir stuff to put on my resume so that when we had that intro chat, I could talk about some Elixir experience, even though I really had no Elixir experience. So in 7 days, I needed to at least have a few items to put on my resume so that it wasn't purely a JavaScript developer resume. There was something specific and tailored to Elixir on there. And it's important to remember that everyone's journey is going to be different. I already have some programming background. So for me, it's going to be faster to transition into Elixir than someone who is brand new to programming. So just because it took me 14 days from start to finish to pass a technical interview, build up a resume, get enough experience to start working as an Elixir dev, doesn't mean that's going to be your timeline, and that's totally okay. So in 7 days, I needed to learn enough Elixir to engage in conversation about it and have enough of an Elixir-focused resume to be considered for the position. And fortunately, I love to write. Writing allows you to teach others what you learn. It's a great way to be able to put experience onto your resume, and by teaching what you're learning, in this case, learning about Elixir, teaching is one of the most effective ways to learn. I think I've said this before on the podcast, but if you can find opportunities to teach, you'll take a thing that you thought you understood, and because you need to summarize it for someone else, one, you'll condense the ideas down and make them even simpler in your head so they'll be easier to remember and easier to recall. But two, you will find out that even though you thought you understood something, as you try to explain it, you'll realize that there are gaps in your knowledge. And so by being forced to explain it, you will be forced to realize what you don't know, and you will deepen your understanding. Anytime you want to learn something, it's worth taking the time to really dissect it and summarize it down into a list of subjects that you want to pick up. So for me, using that ability to write about programming as a method of learning about programming, I spent some time focusing on the core Elixir syntax and writing about the Elixir fundamentals. So this inspired my article, The 20% of Elixir Syntax You Need to Read 80% of Elixir Code. And if you're familiar with that 20%, 80% rule, that's often called the Pareto principle. And the idea behind that is there's this principle that pops up over and over and over again, which is that in order to accomplish 80% of whatever you're trying to do, there is a 20% of action that you need to take. So in order to write Elixir, there's a 20% of the core syntax you need to understand to be able to write most Elixir programs, to be able to write 80% of Elixir. And then there's an 80% of Elixir that you need to be able to write 20%. And so by learning that core 20%, you can reduce what you need to pick up immediately and maximize the impact and value that you get out of it. And so leveraging that rule, I focused on writing about the Elixir fundamentals, picking up all of the different pieces of core syntax, picking up all of the different data types, and then summarizing them as concisely as I could. Now, Elixir did help with this process because Elixir feels highly thought out, modular, and readable. That makes it easier to pick up the language because you're reading it like natural English as opposed to something that is a little bit more esoteric. And so I found that Elixir as a language was actually easier to dissect, condense, and learn. And part of this is because because Elixir stemmed from the Ruby on Rails community, which is already known for having a very readable syntax and focuses on having a high developer quality of life experience. And so because Elixir got to build off of that foundation and make it even better, in my opinion, Elixir makes it easier and more gentle to learn and understand its syntax. It also has excellent documentation, and if you're comfortable reading that type of documentation, if you already have a programming background, that makes it that much easier to learn and pick up. And if you're curious, I'll leave that article in the show notes so that if you want a quick overview of everything I learned during that period of time, you can read that article. One other benefit I found during that period of time is that because Elixir is a functional programming language, it remains much closer to the original concept of input and output. And so when you're thinking about input and output, as opposed to, I usually think of object-oriented programming as squares and boxes. You have all these little boxes of data and behavior, and those boxes are sending information to each other. And the concept of I had some data, I transformed it, and I returned some data out of that kind of gets lost in that mix. But with functional programming, you're much closer to the input and output of a program, and so that makes it easier to follow and easier to track, and in this case, easier to interpret and understand. Which is kind of funny because I think that functional programming has a reputation for being harder. I remember I was first learning object-oriented programming, and I always saw videos of functional programming, and the impression I got was, oh, that's some very elite style of programming. I just don't get it. No one could explain functional programming to me in a way that actually made any sense, and so I just assumed it was really complicated and hard. And I think that functional programming has this brand of being hard, but learning more about it, I found that functional programming was actually easier than object-oriented programming. And I've heard people like Jeffrey Mathias say this before, functional programming feels more akin to the way that you wanted to write code when you first started writing code, and then you have object-oriented programming kind of forced upon you. But functional programming feels very natural as a way of writing code. It's just sticking true to the concept of input and output. And one other thing that made Elixir easier to learn and adopt was its built-in testing system. So I think I've talked about this before, but because Elixir has this built-in testing system, XUnit, you don't have to struggle learning all the different test frameworks that are out there, how to configure them. There's no overhead. You just automatically have built-in automated testing that you can start using and writing right away the moment you start an Elixir program. And that minimizes the amount of information that you have to learn right from the get-go. So you don't need to pick up the test runner, you don't need to figure out how to configure it, and you don't need to take all these extra mental overhead, even just thinking about what test runner you're going to use. There are so many options within the JavaScript ecosystem, and there's not a lot of unification, and there's different testing systems just for slightly different frameworks. Whereas Elixir, I've found, has done a much better job unifying its ecosystem. And because it has that built-in testing system, more or less everyone is using the same tools, and that makes it far easier to ramp up with. And this is true of the ecosystem in general. Elixir has done a much better job, in my opinion, of unifying on its ecosystem and making sure that there are tools for the job, but not so many tools that you become overwhelmed with the amount of choice you have. In JavaScript, if you're trying to make a full stack application, you have 4 or 5 main choices for your front end framework. You have 4 or 5 main choices for your back end framework. You don't even have to use a JavaScript backend. You just can if you want to. And then you also have all sorts of different full stack choices that'll cover the entire thing for you. So deciding what to learn becomes almost as exhausting as actually going and learning it. Whereas Elixir, I've found, has done a much better job of, okay, you want to learn web development? Go and learn Phoenix. That is going to cover pretty much the entire stack for you. It comes prepackaged with all of the tools, and you don't have this mental overhead of deciding, well, do I want to be a mean stack developer or a MERN stack developer? And those, just if you're not familiar in JavaScript, there's MERN, which is Mongo Express React Node, and mean, which is Mongo Express Angular Node, which just describe the stacks needed to become a full stack JavaScript developer. And Angular and React are 2 different front-end frameworks for building out your UI in JavaScript. And you can see there are so many choices in JavaScript that you really just have a hard time figuring out what it is that you should even be learning. And so this minification of what I had to learn, learning the core fundamentals, and also having this built-in testing system, that made it so that in 7 days I could pick up enough Elixir to be able to talk about it at the first interview and write enough about it so that I had some Elixir experience to show. And after 7 days, showed up to the interview, and they were happy with what I had been able to do in that time. They were happy with my experience writing Elixir. And so from there, they moved me on forward to the next interview. And now this is where things get more challenging, because in the first interview, it was really an introductory chat. It was more to get a sense of the position, get a sense of my background, and just have an exploratory chat with each other. The second interview would be much more technical. It would involve a live debugging challenge, and I would also need to build some sort of demonstration project to show that I could write a program in Elixir. And so I had another 7 days or so to accomplish all of that. I was armed with some Elixir fundamentals, but now it was time to really dig in deep and start building things with Elixir. So in order to learn more about Elixir and create a demo project, I wanted to pick a project that would allow me to learn some of the fundamentals of web development in Elixir. So I wanted it to be a Phoenix project, and I wanted it to be some sort of CRUD application. And so if you're not familiar with the term CRUD, CRUD stands for create, read, update, and destroy. I think some people sometimes say delete. This is basically the principles of manipulating data. And by manipulating data this way, you can create pretty much all of the applications that you see on the web are some form of a CRUD application. And for this, I found that a blog would be a perfect project for learning how to perform those fundamental operations with Phoenix quickly, and it would allow me to pick up the necessary skills for the job, because if you can build one CRUD application, you have the skills to build more CRUD applications, and that was what I would be doing. I'd be building some sort of CRUD web application for this position. So in order to give it an Elixir spin, I did decide to add an element of real time to it. So what I wanted was that when you create a blog post, if anyone is looking at the feed of blog posts on a different tab, on a different browser, I wanted it so that that blog would immediately show up in the feed without them needing to refresh the page. And Elixir and Phoenix are incredibly good at doing that. That's one of the main selling points of Elixir in general, is that it's really good at those types of real-time features. And if you're curious about what came out of that, I will put the GitHub in the show notes. Obviously, it is very beginner code. It was one of the first real projects I built in Elixir and Phoenix. So, but it was a great way to get a fast applied overview of web development with Elixir. So if you are thinking about how to learn Elixir effectively and how to learn Phoenix effectively, learning by doing is one of the most effective ways of learning. The two effective ways of learning are teaching and doing. And so building a project is going to teach you faster than reading a book or pretty much anything that you can do other than maybe teaching. And so if you're trying to learn Elixir and you want to learn the skills that are most critical to web development, for example, you want to pick a project that is closely related to whatever it is that you're going to be doing. So you can spend a lot of time, for example, picking up OTP concepts or macros or all of these sort of typical advanced features in Elixir. But realistically, what you should be doing to start, in my opinion, is really focusing on the core concepts that you're going to be using every day and making sure that you're very good with CRUD applications and building out your MVC architecture for a Phoenix project. And just in case, I'm going to explain what I mean by some of those concepts. So OTP is the Open Telecom Platform. It's a framework for real-time features that Elixir is built on, and that Erlang, which is the language that Elixir is built on. And so a lot of people talk about OTP as one of the primary benefits of Elixir, being able to build these real-time features by using the abstractions provided by OTP. However, in my experience, I actually didn't learn any I actually have kind of a funny story. I didn't learn any OTP concepts in order to prepare because I knew it wasn't the most important thing. In Elixir and Phoenix, you benefit from a lot of the concepts in OTP without actually needing to write or understand those things. And those are always things that you can pick up later. So if you're learning things to prepare for your first Elixir job, that's not necessarily where I think your effort should be going, but it is important to pick up later on. And so in the interview, actually, in the first intro interview, they asked me, are you familiar with OTP? And I said, yeah, sure, one-time passcode, right? Which is how I was familiar with OTP. Was we talked about OTP with regards to one-time passcodes for security in JavaScript. So bit of a funny, I'm glad they were willing to overlook that in the intro interview. So this blog taught me about MVC architecture in Phoenix, and if you're not familiar with MVC, is Model View Controller. It's a way of organizing web applications. So you have the controller, which essentially you have some sort of routing in your application, and let's say a user tries to log in, that would be caught by your router, and then the router would delegate to some sort of controller. And so you might have a login request, and that delegates to the login controller, who's going to handle all of the information that needs to be associated with that. If you are retrieving the list of blogs, for example, that would delegate to a blog controller, which would retrieve the list of blogs for the user to display on the page. And the displaying of that information is usually called the view. And in Phoenix, there are different ways of handling views. There's more static views and controllers, but now things are shifting more and more to live views, which are more reactive and allow you to have more real-time feedback with the user. So learning about live view is really important. And the M part of MVC is the model. So this is the data. In Phoenix, you're given this out-of-the-box tool set called Ecto, and Ecto handles all of your data persistence and interaction with your database. And so by building out this blog application, I needed to learn how to create blog schemas, how to create the actual blogs in the database, how to retrieve them, and all of that involves delegating to a controller and then using the Ecto framework to create, read, update, and delete data that is in your database. For the real-time component of the blog, this required learning about PubSub in Phoenix, and so PubSub stands for Publish and Subscribe, and it's a way of broadcasting and receiving messages that different parts of your application can respond to. For example, you can subscribe to a particular topic in your live view, and your live view, remember, is responsible for displaying information. So in this case, let's say it's displaying a list of blogs, and then you can subscribe to any topics related to adding blogs, editing blogs, deleting blogs, and whenever that action occurs, you can respond to it on the page. In this case, I think I simply refetched the list of blogs, but you could be more advanced with it. There's lots of different things that you can do, and this makes it so that anytime something hits your server and makes a change to your list of blogs, the live view can receive those messages and then respond and display it on the page. And this is how you get those real-time features and can have blogs live add, live edit, and live delete without the user needing to refresh their page. And it's really amazing. Phoenix can enable this for you with really only a few lines of code. And normally in other languages, accomplishing stuff like that tends to be quite challenging and tricky, but Phoenix really does make that simple. Now, the other goal of the second technical interview was to debug. So with that demonstration project out of the way, I started focusing on debugging tools. And during this time, I wrote an article called Debugging Phoenix and Elixir Applications in Visual Studio Code. And this was my way to familiarize myself with all of the different debugging tools that Elixir provides. And so primarily that focused on understanding the I/O module. So the I/O module in Elixir is essentially just a bag of functions related to input-output to the console. And so the io.inspect function is pretty much the most important one to be aware of, in my opinion. And you can wrap any variable, any value in an io.inspect function call, and that will allow you to log that value to the console so that as your application is running, you can read that value and debug your code. And what I think is really cool about that in Elixir compared to other languages is that it actually returns the value that you pass into it, which is such a small detail, but really, really important for debugging. Because in JavaScript, when you're using a console.log statement, which essentially does the same thing of printing, but it always returns undefined, you can't simply, as far as I'm aware, wrap a value in a console.log. You often have to do some refactoring to your code in order to make it debuggable, which I found for new developers can be really tricky to understand. And so you have to make changes. So for example, let's say you're passing in a value directly. Well, now you need to extract it out into a variable and then log that variable. Whereas in Elixir, you can literally put an io.inspect inside of a function call and after the declaration of a variable on the same line. And because you can also use pipe, you don't even need to wrap the function call of the io.inspect around your variable. You can just pipe that variable value into the io.inspect, and that makes it so that without actually editing any code, just by adding code, you can inspect and debug values. That is just super cool. You also have the ability in Elixir to pry using the IEX module. So you require IEX, and then you call IEX.pry. And this allows you to essentially run a breakpoint in your code. So as the application is running, it will pause execution and say, hey, I just encountered a pry breakpoint. Do you want to inspect here? And you say yes, and then you can use your integrated shell, your Elixir terminal, and execute code as though your context was on the line that you pried into. So you can see the value of all of the variables, you can run and execute code, you can do all sorts of really cool stuff that you normally couldn't do in the debugger, and you can do it live. So it's as your code is running, you just pry into it, and then you can see all of the values. And this is super useful if it's not just one value that you want to debug, but you want to be able to actually interact and see all the values that are at a particular spot in your code. You can also accomplish a very similar thing in Visual Studio Code with a little bit of configuration, although I found it personally more reliable to simply use the Prime module. I found that Visual Studio Code just isn't quite as reliable as I would like, and it's not always easy to configure in new projects, so Prime tends to be my go-to tool, unless I'm working on something of my own, in which case I might try to get the Visual Studio Code debugger working properly. And understanding debugging is critical, not just because I had to do it as part of the technical interview, but because if you can debug and fix your applications, then you'll never be stuck. You'll be able to figure out what the problem is. And often, as a developer, 10% of your time is spent writing code, and the other part of it is spent reading and debugging code and figuring out why does it behave the way that it does. And if you can effectively debug, you have the ability to write higher quality code because you know how to find the bugs in it. And related to debugging is testing. Learning how to test effectively is incredibly important. In doing the Phoenix project, I tried to do some TDD, and I pretty much always try to do test-driven development whenever it's possible. And having an understanding of what you want your code to do is incredibly important for your design and for actually writing the code. But if you're a new developer onboarding onto a team, being able to write tests and having a solid test suite can help you feel comfortable when you're onboarding. So I knew that I wanted to be good at testing in Elixir. Even if I wasn't great at writing code in Elixir, I needed to be competent at testing, because if I could test my code, writing the code would simply flow out of that. So learning all the different ways of testing different parts of your Elixir application is super important. And it also enables you to write with confidence. So if you can have a solid test suite, then you can write your code and know that your code hasn't broken anything, which if you're a new developer on a new project, that is just so reassuring, knowing that you haven't broken anything. So if you can find a team that does have good testing, or if you can push good testing practices, that is going to actually help you onboard and help you learn. And with that collection of skills, I went to the second interview. I passed the technical. I did their debugging challenge, and using those same tools I just described, was able to figure out what was going wrong. They essentially, I think this is a really cool way of interviewing, actually. They gave me a version of their project that had a bug that used to exist, and then they told me about the bug, showed me how to reproduce the bug, and then asked me to figure out what the problem was. And we went through, I showed them how to follow the flow of execution of the code and how I would go about debugging it. And those skills of figuring out, hey, something's not working right, how do I find that, are super, super important and difficult to learn on your own. This is why understanding those core tools in Elixir is very valuable, and writing projects is very valuable. And we went through the experience, found the bug, found the problem, and then we brainstormed some possible ways of solving it. At the end of it, they gave me an offer, and I accepted, and that's how I wound up getting into the Elixir industry. 14 days and half a year later, I have found that Elixir enables you to onboard quickly, so you can write testable, readable, high-quality code. It feels easy to learn and hard to master. The learning curve is gradual, and because of its modularity, you can learn each concept independently of others. With only the basics, you can get a lot done. And if you want to learn more and dive deeper, there are tons of resources out there. And whenever you do struggle or have a highly contextual question or problem, the community has been and will continue to be incredibly supportive and helpful. So there are people in the community who, whenever you get stuck, there's always been someone there who can answer a question. With Elixir, you get the advantages of the OTP platform and can support common real-time features through relatively simple abstractions. And Elixir handles all these common scenarios without the need to add tons and tons of external dependencies and learn new systems. And when you do add a new library, they feel like a natural extension to Elixir rather than separate systems. So that is going to be it for this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you enjoyed this story, and hope you're feeling inspired to go and learn more about Elixir yourself or help other people onboard and learn Elixir. If you want to have a conversation with me about this, if you have any questions about the story, or you want to share your own experience onboarding into Elixir, which I would love to hear, you can interact with me on Twitter. I'm at Brooklyn J. Myers, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your week.